G'day. So I just finished these two weekender bags and it got me thinking about design and the concept of designing yourself into a corner. So this is the third version of this design. The first version looked like this. So essentially, it's got a seam up the back and down the bottom, made the same way as my tote bags. Now this was a very early example, and I decided to change it because this was a copy of someone else's design and I wanted to do my own thing. And so this was roughly version number 2. It's constructed just like my toiletry bags. You got seams up and down and closed in on the end here. Now, example number 1 of me designing myself into a corner. So this aesthetic of half leather, half canvas is gorgeous. I like it. It has functional value and aesthetic value. So sticking with that. But when changing from this to this, I encountered a problem. Sorry, the afternoon sun is not helping. This seam is stitched, so it's skived, stitched, rolled, and then top stitched. Like so. Now that top stitching, it adds strength, it looks good, and it helps hold that seam nice and flat. So it's non-negotiable. But this one is quite easy because the pattern looks like this. This is a toiletry bag. And so that split is here and here, and top stitching that's easy because it's flat, you just feed it straight through the machine. But what about when you are trying to close up the design? How do you top stitch that when you've got this unwieldy shape? How do you top stitch? There. And so that's problem number 1 I have. I've started out with this look that I want, which is essentially this. This looks good. The way to construct it is pretty easy when you're talking about nice, simple toiletry bag. This top stitch, this split in the colours looks good. This top stitching looks good. But then when you get down to here, it is incredibly hard to actually feed this whole thing through a sewing machine somehow and still end up with a nice, perfectly straight, nicely evenly spaced stitch. Now, looking at this one here, this is one of the best I've ever done, but I can still see some tiny, tiny variations in stitch length because as you're feeding it through the machine, which I tend to do inside out and upside down and all over the place, it's hard to wheel the whole thing and feed it smoothly. So you end up with these issues. And I don't really have an answer. I could buy a post-bed machine which would be the right shape for me to feed this through nicely, but that's a few $1,000s that I would use twice a year. So that's not an option. I could hand stitch it, that's not really an option either, because that's too time consuming. And so I'm stuck. I've designed myself into a corner because I started with what I wanted it to look like, which is this. Like, I'm very happy with what this looks like. And then I just figured out how to get there. But the trouble is, I'm trying to do this for a business, which means I can't just make things however, or do whatever will get the job done. I actually have to consider the process. And now I'm stuck. I've designed myself into a corner. There's no efficient way to do that. So I either spend a ton of money on a new machine, which is not worth it, stick with what I do now, which isn't great, takes a lot of time, delivers an end result that I'm not 100% happy with because I can't get perfectly spaced stitching. Or option 3 is change the design. That's probably what I'll end up having to do. Example number 2 is the lining on these. Now, if you've ever done this style of construction and tried to line it, you know that it's difficult. So the way that I see other people do it, you can basically cut a big hole at the bottom of your lining and then stitch it up. Basically. So you stitch them, your lining to your outer, build it all up, and then kind of flip it out through that hole in the bottom, and then pull that lining out and feed it through a machine. And then you end up with this really obvious, kind of ugly seam down the middle there. That's not what I want. You can do a similar thing up the top here, but then the same problem of you've got to close that up somehow, and you don't want a really obvious stitch. Like I could, in theory, again, top stitching is part of the problem. What I have seen some people do is they'll top stitch most of it and leave that open, and that's the gap that they fold it out through, and then they have to go through afterwards with the bag complete and feed that through a sewing machine and close that up. But then you've got two different top stitches, and that can look obvious. And then on the inside, you'll have a bit that's top stitched and a bit that isn't. And you can't just do the whole thing easily because you get around to this point, and then how do you jump across there easily? Various issues. So what I end up with, again, by starting with what I want it to look like and then working towards just doing whatever it took to get to that point, I end up with something which the end result's gorgeous. And you can't even see it. Essentially, I create two bags. So there's the outer, which looks like that, and the inner, which is this, but inside out. And then I stick the outer into the inner and manually, with a needle, connect the underside of that top stitch to a row of stitching I've added to the lining. And it's a slip stitch, so I'm not actually piercing any material, I'm just grabbing two rows of thread and kind of grabbing there and then there and then. And that is very labor intense. It takes about 90 minutes to sew the lining into one of these. And that's just not profitable. But I don't know what else to do. Again, it's the same problem. I've designed myself into a corner. So I'll give you an example of doing it better. So I said earlier that this is version 3 of this design. And what I changed between version 2 and version 3 was basically going from a flat handle that was held on with rivets and just folded over with painted edges to a rolled handle, stitched, so that sun is very annoying, stitched on, which has to be done by hand. Terrible filming. Oh well. And a rolled edge, so hopefully the camera can show this. So there's no raw edge exposed there. It's not painted, it's not burnished. That is just leather all the way around, which requires a lot of skiving and a lot of fiddling around by hand. Now, at this point, I want that edge that folds over. Let's try and do this. I don't want this bit to be visible, and I also don't want there to be a sudden step as you go down. So what I came up with, again, by thinking about what I want it to look like and then just working away until I got there, was this. So this is cut wider, thinned down, folded in half, and then I've done something ridiculously complicated here, where, there we go. So it tapers inwards. It's got a cut here, so the angle changes here. That is hand skived down that way to thin it down, and that little cutout matches here. So the idea is that when you fold it over, the cutout fits that top, and you end up with one thickness there. So from the outside, there's no sudden bump where it goes up to the next layer. And on the side, all you see is that. It just disappears into itself. That was a massive pain. I was really proud of myself when I came up with that design. I thought it was quite elegant. The end result was exactly what I had in mind. But after making a few of them, I realized that's a massive pain. Very time consuming to cut out all those little notches. Very time consuming to hand skive and machine skive. And not particularly strong, because as you fold it over, if you're stitching up here onto the bag, you're not actually grabbing that inner layer. And so I had to stick it on the bag, sew that down, fold it over, and then sew the outside. And that was way more stuff around than I thought. So what I ended up doing was this. Now, this is probably not going to show up at all. Here we go. So this is a compromise. Right. What I wanted was that backside to just disappear. This doesn't just disappear. Instead, what I've done is cut it wide. Good grief, this lighting. Cut it wide, tapered down the end, folded them in, and then folded it back on itself, like so. There's no big step because it's a tapered skive, but you can still see that tiny bit of back side of the leather. It's fully stitched through both pieces, so it's nice and strong. So it's a compromise. It's not the exact look I want, but this is much, much easier to build and much stronger. And so that's what I've used on here. So I started with what I wanted it to look like, which was this perfect, seamless, fantastic, everything. You know, someone should look at it and go, oh, how's he done that? Except that's not realistic from a business point of view, or from a longevity, like that's not super strong. This isn't perfect, but it's realistic. I can actually make these without ripping my hair out. So my point is, when you're designing stuff, it's really easy to design yourself into a corner where you think, I'm going to make this gorgeous thing and it'll be seamless and it'll be perfect, and just bodge it until you get there, and then realize you're not making any money because it takes hours and hours and hours to do something that should be pretty simple. And sometimes you just need to accept that it's not going to work and compromise. On these things, I'm considering completely changing the design because I just don't see how I could keep making them and make any money and keep them to the standard that I want. Because that's not the only way to construct a bag. Sure, it works like that's super simple for a toiletries bag, but they're different products. There are other ways to construct these that can tick all the boxes. They can be strong and look good and be functional, that don't involve me sitting there for an hour and a half with a needle and thread and hand sewing a lining on. So don't be afraid to just accept your mistakes and change your designs. I'm really happy with these, but I may never make them again. I may decide that this version 3 is not the final version, and I'll take what I learnt on them and do something completely better, or better that might be completely different. And that's fine. I've been doing these for years now. They're one of my first products. I'm really proud of them. But I got kids now, I got bills to pay. Maybe it's time to do something completely different. So there you go, that's your lesson. Don't design yourself into a corner.